welcome to the convention, and also welcome to me to be back once again at the Theosophical Society in America's annual summer convention. It's been a little while for me. I should say this is the 134th time, 134th annual convention for the section here in the United States, which seems to say that over such a long time, we must have been doing something right somewhere along the way. But it's very good to be here. No doubt we all recognize that this is a very different convention get-together than has ever been before, it being virtual. And although it's something that is not traditional and is not something with which we have become accustomed, quite honestly, I'm starting to find there are great advantages to being forced online. Obviously, it wasn't the thing that we did by natural choice, but having been forced into getting together in this way, there are some very, very strong advantages to this. One of them being, obviously, that you're sitting at home and your physical presence, the travel and all that goes with that, isn't required for us to share. As we go along, we'll be able to refine matters so that we can share and feel that the actual communication is of a high level, even though we do necessarily lose something of the social aspect. But I'm happy to be a part of this very first of its kind. This year for our Theosophical Society International Convention, it'll be the same. You know, when we begin in December, we anticipate that there will be no such sort of gatherings of groups as we have been accustomed to in the past 134 years. So it's very good to be a part of this and to have an opportunity, as always, to share some thoughts. And hopefully our thinking together, whether virtual or face-to-face, we will be able to create something of a magnetic center that perhaps might be able to propel us all to new understandings, and perhaps may also be able to impact and interact with the world in which we live. So that's part of the process of this coming together, whether it's virtual or whether it's face-to-face. The creation of these powerful magnetic centers that draw to them these sorts of hidden intelligence that stands behind this theosophical movement is something that, whether we're doing it online or whether we're doing it in a physical space, is worth the doing. So today, the fact that the convention this year is focused on living theosophy, this is an area I feel very comfortable in speaking toward. So the idea of the cultivation and the application of certain inner guidelines or certain inner wisdom that we have the ability to access is something that is of paramount importance, particularly in times such as the ones we're living in now. So all of us, any one of us who finds themselves attracted to and legitimately engaged in what we might call a spiritual path, it's something that is inevitably the result of questions that have arisen within us. Very often these questions may have lain dormant for years, perhaps even for lifetimes, but there comes a time in every life where we start to feel as though deeper answers are needed, which also means that deeper questions must arise from within us. So this is something of the process that we find ourselves engaged with now. Obviously, when we speak about questions and asking questions, I always find myself going back to this beautiful quote, which probably many people are familiar with, from the poet, mystical poet, Rainer Maria Rilke. And we're quite familiar with this idea that we must live the questions. Questions are not about, questions at the level we're speaking of, are not matters of information. It's something more. And from his way of putting it, live the questions is what we're familiar with, but it comes from a much more expansive response that he gave to another young poet. And I'd just like to share that just briefly because it puts into perspective the sort of questioning and the sort of inquiry that is beyond just a mental or an intellectual exercise. So here's what Rilke said in his letter to a young poet. He said, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers, which cannot be given to you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer." To me, that's beautiful. Really, it speaks about the nature of a type of questioning that's not about just receipt of information, but is really more involved with the process of unfoldment. That as we ask the deep questions, as we live with the questions, the answers inevitably appear. Perhaps not on our schedule, but it's the process that makes the realization, the revelation of these deeper layers of being possible. So the nature of the questions that we ask will be determined by our particular degree of unfoldment. We're all probably familiar with in the Bible, St. Paul talks about, when I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. And he was speaking not so much about the obvious things that we don't play with in sandboxes at a certain age, or we don't have tinker toys, although Legos seem to be quite popular still, but that there are degrees of unfoldment. And along with those degrees, we see, we speak, we understand very differently. So there's particular questions that we find ourselves asking. And very often, one of the first questions that we ask are the big ones. Why am I in this world? Why is the universe as it is? The why questions. And these are the very big questions, which really are somewhat unanswerable, at least in terms that we would be capable of understanding. I mean, probably any one of us, if you have had children or if you've been around children of a certain age, certainly as a parent, there is a stage where there's a degree of questioning that can become very, very burdensome at times. There is this moment where a child will start asking why over and over again, where their minds, their imaginations are trying to come to grips with this world that they have been thrown into. And so why questions? So anyone who has ever had to go through that, you know that it really doesn't take too many why questions for our ability to answer to unravel. I mean, you take the traditional question, Mommy, Daddy, why is the sky blue? Depending on your physics background, You may have a slightly different answer, but you start off, well, dear, the light that you see coming from the sun, it's actually white, but it breaks into a spectrum of all different colors. Sounds good. But obviously a further question of, well, why is that? Tests your physics or tests your ability to answer. So if you know a little bit more, then, the molecules and the particles that are in the atmosphere absorb different colors within the spectrum and scatter the rest of the light. Why? If you really studied it, then you might revert to something like, well, it's a result of the Rayleigh scattering effect. Lord Rayleigh discovered this. But then one more why question, and it drives many persons to the response, look, I don't know. God made it that way. You want to know? Ask him. Or some other sort of frustrated response. But why is a high order of question, because it's something that points our attention in a certain direction, but ultimately it's unanswerable in what we would normally think of as satisfying sorts of terms. The great scientist and member of the Theosophical Society, Rupert Sheldrake, I do like an answer that he gave when someone asked him, why are things the way they are? And his response, which, it can sound clever, but it's true. Things are the way they are because they were the way they were. That the one comes out of the other. And so it's a correct answer. Maybe not satisfying, but also it's something that speaks to the nature of our role in this world. Things are as they are, but any sort of shift in that status necessarily leads us to a new and different possibility. So in terms of questions that we ask, why? It's a beautiful question. But it's also one that is not actionable. It's not something that we can necessarily translate into behaviors or practices that can affect our consciousness. So the other order of questions, the who, what, when, where, how questions, beginning with, who am I? Who am I? I mean, obviously, if we didn't have some sense of identity, it would be very difficult to function in this world. But are those identities that we adopt, that we have been assigned, are they correct? Is that, in fact, who we are? So some degree of examination of that starts to have an effect on us and starts to drive us perhaps ever more deeply into other levels of questioning. Who am I? What is the nature of my current condition? Why? I mean, how, not why, but how is it that I feel limitations? How is it that I feel fears? What is the nature of the fears that I feel? Those sorts of things are questions that we can examine and that lead us into actions, practices that we can cultivate and apply. And ultimately, the questions of how do I address this, whatever it is, this sense of limitation, this feeling that I am not somehow not free, this feeling of confinement, this feeling that there are latent things within me that have yet to be expressed. How do I interact with that? So these are other levels of question that necessarily become a part of our process. And ultimately, For anyone who goes along this line to any depth, again, we start to find that the answers that we are looking for aren't found at the surface. And ultimately, this is something that drives us in the direction, drives us into this whole field that is spoken of as the ageless wisdom. Theosophy, divine wisdom, ageless wisdom, even ancient wisdom. Although ancient wisdom is not the equivalent of ageless. Ancient wisdom is something that has appeared in a time and place, has a particular form, spoke to a particular culture. It's been expressed. It is an aspect of an ageless root that appears in every civilization, in every culture. But this ageless wisdom, we start to find that it's something that is the area, is where we find answers, where we find the possibility of answers. So as we approach this body of wisdom teachings, we start to find that there are certain very profound ideas. It begins as an idea. It begins as a concept that speaks to us because in some way it seems to touch upon things that we recognize as true within us. Perhaps it's never been articulated, but very, very powerful ideas that can then become experiences are embodied in this whole thing that we call the ageless wisdom. Certain principles. Probably most important among them all, the idea of oneness or unity, that the possibility of separation only exists in our imagination. So that's an idea that we experiment with. The idea that we are multi-dimensional beings. It's easy to express, but as we question that and as we go deeper, we start to explore these various dimensions of our being. In theosophical terms, we're fond of thinking in terms of 7 different dimensions of being. But as we start to question, as we start to explore, then it has an effect on us. There is the idea in this ageless wisdom tradition that there is no empty space, that this is an intelligent universe in all of its parts. So there is no place, no being, no thing that lies outside of this universal consciousness. It's all expressive of that. That's another idea that we explore and that leads us in many possible, profound, and life-altering directions. There is the idea that each and every one of us is responsible for our own unfoldment, for our impact on this world in which we live and the people and beings among whom we circulate. We are responsible for that. Beautiful little book, The Idol of the White Lotus, has this quotation that we find throughout theosophical literature, but the 3 truths. The first being that the soul of man, so the soul of the human being, is immortal. And its future is the future of a thing whose growth and splendor have no limit. So we are involved in a process of unfoldment. This growth and splendor is without limit. Is a powerful idea of this ageless wisdom tradition, one of the 3 truths that's spoken of. There is the idea that there is this overarching spiritual presence. So the spirit which lives within us, and it's within and it's without. and it cannot be tasted, smelled, touched. None of the senses can interact with this spirit, but that it can, in fact, be perceived by whoever it is who sincerely desires perception. Whoever it is that enters into this process of questioning and living with those questions can, in fact, perceive. And then the third truth is that each and every one of us is our own absolute lawgiver, the dispenser of glory or gloom to ourselves. So, decreer of our own reward and punishment. These are some of the words that are said in that. So the idea that we are responsible for our unfoldment, we are responsible for our actions, we are responsible for our thinking. These are core ideas within this ageless wisdom tradition that then we are invited to think about, to experiment with, and to find our place, our connection with these ageless wisdom truths. Now there is this problem, though. It's a problem only in the sense that at a certain point in our unfoldment, probably most of us would like to feel comfortable. We don't really want to rock the boat a lot. We don't want a whole lot of changes, particularly of an inner sort, because those can be very disquieting, very discomforting. But, it is one of the facts of any genuine spiritual path that necessarily the process invites crisis. The idea of stripping away, cherished sorts of separative identities is often not a comfortable one. So when we ask, who am I? There are certain things that we always point to. In my case, male, American, born of a certain race, a certain religion. These are ideas that we imbibe in youth, accept in later life, and declare as our identity as things go on. But then we start to find that those are in fact limiting, in the sense that they are, in every case, only relatively true, and in every case separative from others. So as those things are taken away, it can be a very uncomfortable thing. And so what we end up doing is this. In terms of questions, when you look back at, for instance, historical precedents, someone like Siddhartha, who became the Buddha, if you really look at his story, it started with, well, 2 questions, but probably it started with 3 questions. He was raised as a prince. His father, who was the king, tried to protect him from any sense of illness or not beauty in the world, because he had been told that this boy that was born would either be a great king or a great spiritual savior for humanity. Father, being a king, chose to cultivate the king aspect. So the boy was protected from any blemish in the world. But at one point he goes to his father, and the first question he asks is, I've been raised within the walls of the palace. I have never set foot outside. I would like to go and see what is in the world outside of the palace walls. Can I do that, Father? It was a very disturbing moment for the king, because he had controlled the palace environment so thoroughly. But he said yes, and took it upon himself to control the environment that his son would see on this promenade out into the world beyond the walls of the palace. So, as we know the story, on that he went out 3 times. The first time he went out, somehow there was someone by the road who was sick, body covered in sores. And so the question he asked his chariot driver, first question is, what is that? And he said, that's a sick person. Siddhartha, having never seen this before, having been shielded from it, he asks, will that in fact happen to me? And the answer was yes, of course. Take me back to the palace. He goes out a second day, he sees a person who is old, gray, bent with age. Having never seen that, the father had manipulated his environment so carefully he had never seen an old person. Same question, same 2 questions. What is that? Old age? Will that happen to me? Yes. Third day he goes out, he sees someone who had died. And the same 2 questions. What is it? Will it happen to me? These are the 3 questions. First, can I explore? And then the second was the what is it? And the third is that also true for me? And that's what propelled him into his journey into becoming the Buddha. You know, various austerities, times in the forest, all of those sorts of things. So with us, you know, if we're really going to be accurate in looking at this spiritual path, just as soon as we find ourselves embracing that, really what we are doing is embracing a process where we ourselves are engineering crisis within our inner lives. Obviously, no matter whether you're involved in a spiritual path or not, crisis is unavoidable just by virtue of the fact of birth. You know, we're born, we grow. Anybody knows as you were growing up, you had all kinds of mental and emotional crises that came along with that. As we get older, you know, we take on positions, we take on jobs, we take on families, we take on all levels of responsibility. And then as things progress, what you start to find, particularly if you are fortunate to actually grow older, you start to find that one way or another, there is this ongoing series of losses that take place. One thing after another gets taken away. You know, it's your hair color, or it's your hair goes away. Teeth go away. Your level of vitality goes away. You lose friends, you lose loved ones. As it goes on, it's really a process of kind of stripping things down to the barest essential. And at some point, what we become aware of is that that barest essential, beyond the body, beyond the senses, beyond the jobs, beyond the friends and families and loved ones, the barest essential is this essential of consciousness. So consciousness is what remains when all else disappears. And one of the most fundamental aspects of this ageless wisdom tradition is this, that there is this common expression that I know I am a spark from an eternal flame. So the idea that we are identical in nature to the universal consciousness from which we have appeared We are in very, very true sense a concentration, a centralization of the universal consciousness. And all that it is within us. And so we find ourselves always, whether it's conscious or whether it's unconscious, inevitably we find ourselves driven to unfold these latent powers that are always there hiding within us. And so along this process, H.P. Blavatsky, one of the things that she talked about was that there is this spiritual nature that is inseparable from who we are, but that it's continually hidden. And it's hidden by, she describes it in a variety of ways, but hidden by a personality. The body, the emotions, the mentality that are continually active and continually throwing up clouds that block our experience and block our view of what might be described as the spiritual nature. Every now and then we have moments of brief realization, but they come and they fade. And in many respects, what she said was that in order to have any genuine experience of the spiritual nature, what was required was that we must learn how to paralyze, was her words, paralyze the personality. In effect, that the personality has to be quieted so that it no longer prevents the expression of this deeper nature. So when we go into this whole process, where we are thinking in terms of asking questions, living questions, going deeper, there are certain tools that we find ourselves reverting to. The tools for the spiritual life, you could think in terms of meditation, prayer, mantra, fasting, study, retreat, or what we have a little bit too much of nowadays, isolation. I think everybody's had about enough of that for a while. But as a spiritual tool, it's one of those things that is very, very valuable. So right now, we find ourselves in a very unusual and specific moment. Just in terms of the things that we find going on in the world around us today, I think for many people, we're viewing it as something of a shifting, a time of shifting, a time of certainly of crisis, and a great deal of discomfort for many, many people. And it's a time necessarily when we find that things are changing, where again we start to ask deeper questions. One of the things that I think many people, particularly people who have had some grounding in a spiritual practice, are asking themselves is, given the enormity of the situation that seems to be unfolding in the world, what is it that I can do? How is it that I can interact with this scene in a way that it can have an effect? Something new has come into the world, a virus that has never before been seen in the community of human beings, and it's having effects. There are all sorts of social dislocations that are occurring as a result of this. Economic issues have arisen. Other sorts of profound social issues, not even related to this virus, have suddenly arisen and taken traction in the planet as a whole. One man killed in Minnesota then has become a lightning rod for similar sorts of vision of inequities in our society around the world. I talk to people in countries around the world. It's just kind of what I do. And they are marching in all throughout Europe, all around the world. The ageless wisdom, of course, is something that has been present in pandemics before this one, throughout wars, throughout social changes, throughout climate changes. It has always been something that has been available and present. So for us today now, we have to try to learn how to express that. And obviously there is no formula for this. We often wish there was a formula for enlightenment or a formula to immediately address the problems in the world. But there are very specific things that we can do. I do know that I know people who have had a very profound spiritual practice for many, many years, who find themselves feeling overwhelmed at this moment. This kind of isolation that many of us have kind of wished we had so that we could really have an opportunity to go deeper is something that becomes a burden to many. So, what is it that we do? What are the next steps? So probably for our purposes, I just want to talk about 4 areas. And these are things that are not specific to this moment, but they are things that really apply across every sort of, not only crisis, but through every moment that we find ourselves engaging with the world. So always, one of the ageless advices throughout time, we have been advised that we need to learn how to experiment with quiet. We speak in terms of meditation practice very often, but to learn to experience and to extend what we would call times of quiet on a regular basis is something that is very, very valuable for this particular moment. Now, obviously, for centuries, this advice has been given, but largely it was relegated to the religious communities. In recent years, the level of scientific study of the qualities and the effects of meditation practice have been studied quite intensively. And so now it's one of those things where, from a scientific point of view, the value of meditation practice or even relaxation practice is unassailable. Immune system strengthened, stress reduction, actual changes and modifications of the brain's structure in very positive ways, a whole list of effects that can be realized just through this practice of a regular attempt at quieting the mind. I'm quite surprised. For many, many years, obviously meditation has been something that has been espoused in many quarters. The Theosophical Society, of course, throughout its history has, tried to educate about the benefits. Now, I was looking the other day, and in the New York Times, there was a section on the best apps for you to meditate. Because now there are apps for your iPhone, for your smartphone, for your computer, that deal specifically with meditation, and they are hugely growing in popularity. I have a very good friend who for years wanted to try to meditate. We would talk about it, we would work on it, but then he'd go home. And the regularity of it, he could never quite get it until he found his app. I think it's called Balance. But these are very positive things that actually lead people in terms of meditation practice. Meditation in and of itself is something quite deeper, different from just the practice. But the beginning to become quiet, introduces us to deepening levels of our own being. From quiet, there is the possibility of a genuine stillness, where all else falls away except that one focus of our meditation practice moment. And then there's also the actual possibility of a real silence, where everything related to the mind, to ourselves, disappears, and we find ourselves at that moment actually experiencing genuine meditation, which of course goes beyond the biological effects of meditation practice. Those are there. But it's a much deeper level of realization, deeper level of power that can then flow through us and into this world. So this is something that is of constant value during any time, shifting times, crisis times, times of complete peace and contentment. Regular experimentation with quiet. So that's very, very important. One of the other things that is also true is that anyone who has moved into something they would call as a spiritual practice or a spiritual path, it can be kind of stressful. I mean, we've spoken about the way that we are engineering crisis in our inner lives by this whole practice. So we have to be able to develop ways to ground ourselves, to connect ourselves in ways where we are not overwhelmed and the mind is not overwhelmed. The great spiritual saint Nagarjuna, although he was speaking about mantra in particular, he made the statement that without the discipline of protecting the mind, of what use are all other disciplines? So unless we can ground ourselves in ways that the stresses and the strains of normal life and of the inner life don't overwhelm us, then everything else we do is for naught. So we have to learn how to do that. H.P. Blavatsky was asked on one occasion, what is it that is most important for the study of theosophy? So really it could be rephrased, what is it that is most important for this deepening of the spiritual life? And she gave a very interesting response, because she said, in effect, that there are three senses that are required. So she said, what is required is number one, common sense. Number two, sense of humor. And number three, more common sense. So it's an answer that seems, again, so many of these answers can seem cute, can seem clever, but common sense is sometimes in very short supply, and I think it's a very underrated quality, because the sense of that which is common, that which is shared, the clear focus on the nature of relationships at the human level is something that really is at the level we could call ordinary. It is a reflection of a much deeper capacity of intuition, buddhi, that perceives relationships, perceives the nature in which all things work together. Common sense is that quality when applied to just what we would speak of as normal human relationships. So this is something that is very important. And it's often in very short supply, particularly when we think about people who embrace a spiritual path. The possibility for imbalance is enormous in this world. So we have to be able to ground ourselves. And we do so through exercising common sense. Sense of humor. I mean, obviously we find very often people who, if someone's not, if someone is smiling and they're supposedly involved with the spiritual practice, many people feel as if it's something that needs to be dismissed. They can't be serious. My particular point of view, I have had the great fortune of having been associated with some profoundly spiritual people for short and for long periods. But in every case, I have found that those who are the deepest among them always have the most cultivated sense of humor. I mean, the Dalai Lama is always has something that's funny to say. But others within the Theosophical movement, the sense of humor has been something that has been able to temper the stresses, the strains. One of the great disciples of the Buddha, Sariputra, he was one of his great disciples, probably the great one. And he one time made the comment that samsara, this constant wheel of repetitive, going from ignorance to birth, to rebirth, to death, is a farce. He was looking at something when he said that. He said samsara is a farce. And what he was looking at was a husband who had his young son in his lap. There was a dog in the yard chewing on fish bones that the husband had eaten a piece of fish. And so what Sariputra was commenting on, he had a vision of the previous lives associated with that particular scene he was looking at. And in the Buddhist cosmology, there is the idea that we migrate from various, not just from human to human in reincarnation, but to other forms. So he's looking and he says the father is sitting with the son in his lap. The son was reborn as a person who tried to sexually assault this man's wife. But because he killed the man, and so this man is reborn as his son. Sariputra is looking at that. The man's father, the husband's father, who had died, this husband was a fisherman. He caught the fish. The fish was his father, who he was eating the fish. The dog had been this fellow's mother. The dog was chewing the bones. The man kicked the dog. And so Sariputra, looking at this whole scene, samsara is a farce. So whether or not we buy into this whole cosmology, perhaps, certainly, many of us see it differently, this process of reincarnation. But the idea being that humor, this perception of the incongruity between what we have accepted as real and what we have accepted as ourself and what is real, if we can't see that from time to time and be able to laugh at that, then we're subject to all sorts of kind of problems along the way. So common sense, sense of humor, and more common sense ground us, make it possible for us to live in this world of amazing contradictions. The third thing that I would talk about is that within each and every one of us, there is this capacity to heal, not just heal ourselves, and not even just to focus on the healing of others. Healing by definition means wholeness, to be whole. So when we are involved in a process of healing, we are involved in a process of the restoration of wholeness. Very often, what people look for when they're looking for healing is the restoration of what they would deem as normalcy. What was normal for me, I just want it back because some condition, health-wise, psychologically, financially, socially, has affected that. I always find myself coming to this wonderful thing that Krishnamurti once said. He said, "It is no sign of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." to be normal in terms of a misguided view of reality is not a sign of health. And what you find is that along the way, anyone who genuinely works with, genuinely embraces a spiritual path necessarily becomes a healer. The presence of such a person restores a sense of wholeness, security, safety, freedom from disease, wherever such a person goes. And when we make this actually something that we place as a matter of importance in our practice, then it becomes intensified, it becomes deepened. I remember very well past president of the TS in America, Dora Kuntz. Of course, she and Dolores Krieger were the ones responsible for bringing the therapeutic touch healing method into the world and teaching it to however many thousands of nurses through nursing schools. But, the process that she described was something that was available to any and everyone. But it begins with what she would describe as centering. So it begins with this drawing within to some sort of center of quiet. Again, as we talked about, the regular experimentation and introducing ourselves into an atmosphere of quiet is where it begins. We become centered. And from that, then, there is the intention to heal. And that's a little bit of a tricky thing, because very often people think that there's some sort of personal element to this healing process, that I am going to heal. But the idea is that we intend to become available for the energies which are ever present around us, to be able to flow in the manner that restores healing. We don't direct how it happens, but we become available. So this is the practice. Based on our intention, it activates certain things within us when we're able to actually become quiet. As a practice for us, certainly it's something that is beneficial to others. The reason why the therapeutic touch method was able to be taught in nursing schools around the world was because it had demonstrable physical, biological effects. Always it resulted in relaxation of whoever it was that this therapeutic touch, whoever it was that the energy was being focused on. They always relaxed. There were responses in the blood, different things like that. But it's beneficial to others. Equally, to the person who regularly involves themselves in such a thing, whether in thought or whether in channeling those energies with the hands, it becomes a benefit to us as well, because we start to become familiar with the flow of these ever-present energies. We start to become familiar with becoming transparent to that, becoming an aid to others in that manner. We also start to connect ourselves with those the healing intelligence that is also everywhere present. So on various levels, we make ourselves available to something that has great benefit in the world. And so, quiet, grounding, healing as focus for us. And then, of course, in the ageless wisdom tradition, the most fundamental principle and the aspect that requires an ever-deepening understanding and realization from us as practitioners is a deepening of our understanding and our experience of unity, oneness, interdependence, interconnection, whatever the way that we phrase it. The importance is the capacity that should be ever growing to experience this condition of not being separate from one another or really from anything. And so again, this is something that as we focus upon it, first it begins as a thought. As we go more deeply into it, particularly in our times of quiet, there will be times when we start to find that the boundaries that we have accepted dissolve, even if momentarily. Definitely in the practice of healing, the absence of a sense of separateness is a requirement. H.P. Blavatsky, in her writing on, well, it wasn't even a writing, it was a teaching that she gave to her inner group toward the end of her life, where she actually developed a diagram of meditation. And the very first thing she talks about, the number one thing she says is first conceive of unity. Before any of the other things that are to follow, first we are to make this effort to conceive of unity. Obviously, unity is beyond conception, but to reach for something which perhaps we're not able to fully grasp. First, conceive of unity by expansion in space. This is kind of a technical advice. To try to embrace by an ever and necessarily unending expansion into a limitless space. That gives us some conception of unity and infinite in time. So unity is the basis of all strength. Unity is the basis of all connection. Unity is the basis of all power and all understanding. So to deepen, to ever hold before ourselves the ideal of union is probably the most important aspect. In the world today, right now we're witnessing a certain turmoil. The hope is that we will move out of such tumultuous moments, but the sort of groundwork that we have been laying as a human family for this moment, there are still other shoes that are waiting to drop. We know this. I mean, the climate aspect of it hasn't even really been heard of in this particular moment that we are experiencing. So the ageless advice for any sort of moving, shifting time are these. And so I would encourage that. As in many senses in Buddhism, they talk about taking refuge. Some people would say that what you're doing is you're trying to find a safe place in a storm. But refuge really means that I will rely upon certain profound truths. Truths that are experienced in the quiet and the stillness and the silence that we invite through our practice. Truths that are observed in the world and translated as common sense, laughed about because it really is. It's funny whether you believe it or not. And most of what we think of as so important really does not matter. The truth of healing, the fact that this is an affirmation of the connections, the indissoluble connections that we all share. And fundamentally, that truth of oneness, unity. In the early days of the Theosophical Society, expressed as universal brotherhood in that particular language. So these are just a few ideas, things that we can cultivate and in many degrees, many ways do. So I'd encourage you to continue. These are times that call forth the best. In many cases, it calls forth the worst. And so we have an opportunity to choose. I'm going to choose for the best. Okay. Thank you, and thanks for your time.